All right, so today we're going to talk about bias and how it shows up in interpretations of facts and even how we share them. So, this will also be tied to some of the things going on in our book. There are two books out about a reserve battalion. So, this is World War II. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was this group of pretty much, middle-aged Germans who were sent over to Poland to help with basically the Holocaust, right? They did everything from traffic control and getting people onto transportation to actually going out into villages and executing Jewish people. Now, there's two books on it. One, Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, and the other, Hitler's Willing Executioners. And what is unique about this battalion is after the war, so many of them were still alive and extensive interviews were done. So they really got to see what was going on and how things changed and stayed the same over the whole course of the war. And these two authors had access to the same information but came up with different interpretations. And spoiler alert coming up, one of them is a little sketchy with how he presents information. So, this battalion, as I said, right, was crowd control, and some of it really just was, okay, we'll move the people here, but they also went out and did executions. They fought the local Polish partisans, which wasn't a big job of what they did. And all along the way, there were some men who said, nope, I'm not doing it, right? And some of the ways that they might do it was just by actually saying, hey, I'm not doing that, and they were known as the ones to not going to go, so you don't take them on that mission. Or when they knew something was coming up, those people who didn't want to be involved, some would just kind of disappear so the officer wouldn't pick them. And of course, there was always plenty of men who would volunteer. So if, and this is very shortened, read both books, if you want, and see what's going on. But I'm going to really oversimplify Goldhagen and then talk about Brown. Basically, looking at this historically, he's saying, hey, look, this country had hugely anti-Semitic for a long time. And there's super specific conditions where everybody just got on board with Hitler, and there was just one crazy bloodlust genocidal hatred of Jews. So because it was so specific to Germany and its people, hey, we don't have to worry about it, right? Because it can't happen here. And again, super oversimplification. Now, Birkmeyer is the name of a particular SS officer who was a horrible, horrible human being. And I mean, he is the type of person who would, oh, I'm going to kill that man and I will make him crawl on the ground for a while first. I mean, so just terrible. And according to Goldhagen, right, and he actually has some quotes going on. He did something terrible, and then it jumps to another quote where the men are going, yep, the Jewish person deserved it, right? Creating this idea that what he did was accepted, approved, and everybody was on board. What he skipped in the interview is that the same men said, that guy is a dirty dog, right? They hated him. He thought he was a disgusting human being, but he cuts that out, creating the impression that everybody was fine with him. Now, those men who thought he was a disgusting human being still went along and did the things, the executions, but they didn't blindly think, oh, that guy is great, which is how it's portrayed when you leave out that part. Now, when you move into your research and you find something you don't like that changes what your idea is, don't do that. That's dishonest. And part of research, if you're really going to do research, you have to be willing to find out that you're wrong, or that your interpretation isn't the only one, or that there are other views. So don't do what he did, right? And you get different results. He edits this out, makes it seem like, yep, everybody was on board, right? Zero nuance. All Germans were the same. Bloodlust, all this, right? Now, Browning, who doesn't take out the parts that say that guy is disgusting, shows a multi-layered approach. There were people on all along the spectrum. Some didn't give a dang about Jewish people at all. Some really did buy into the propaganda. And there were men in the units who would be happily go out and do this, and there was men who wouldn't. There was a bunch in the middle who did it just because they did out of peer pressure. They didn't want to be left out. They did it out of that authority, right? And as we know from psychological tests, you put somebody in a white lab coat and say, do this, most of us will, okay, because we defer to authority, right? So those were the things that he writes about. This is big, no simple answer, right? Oh, there was an interesting thing too, that this should remind you of Borowski, that the men felt more pity for themselves, look at us stuck in this situation, than for the people that they were killing. And think about how that mirrors the men who were leading the people to the gas chamber and getting angry at the people who would fight. And what are they doing, right? Because they felt more pity for themselves being stuck in that situation. So there's a similarity there. Right. I said Brown earlier. It's Browning, my mistake, but I'm not going to go back and edit this. So, couple connections. I already mentioned it, the part about pitying themselves more, right? Another thing is, one of the things that stands Borowski apart is that in his writings he laid bare what they did, and he felt that what they did, or showed that what they did, was also immoral, right? That they would do whatever they did to survive, which led them to be doing horrible things themselves. And when you think about context in the world that Borowski moved to afterwards, right? And he even says this in one of the stories that you'll read shortly, is he gets out, and what's going on in Poland at that time? There's a black market, there's stealing, there's prostitution. So while the execution is gone, so much of the criminal activity that they were doing in the camp, right, or all the things that they did, forget about criminal activity, just the activities that they did that would be considered immoral, right, to survive, is still happening outside of the camps. And there's even a line about how, that American soldier has traveled all the way from Chicago to guard us now, right, because they become prisoners for a while, really, of the Americans and the Allied forces, right? All right. So, as a researcher, you are going to find things that don't fit your narrative, right? Academically, morally, you got to change your narrative, right? Otherwise, you're writing propaganda. You're writing propaganda. And if you want to, then of course, go ahead and do that. But I'm not going to help you on that. And I have a more modern, though still World War II connection, which I thought was interesting. If you're a World War II, somebody interested in World War II, you probably heard of Band of Brothers. You might have watched the HBO special. And this is Stephen Ambrose. And one of the things about Stephen Ambrose, he's very famous, right? He writes a book. It's going to be a bestseller. It's going to be super detailed, right, about what's going on. And the American soldiers are, for the most part, going to be about as wonderful, as moral as you could possibly imagine, right? Which maybe is possible. I mean, I don't know. When I was in the Army, a lot of the people around me seemed to be just like a lot of the people who are around me now. Some of them are good and I would trust with my life, and some of them I wouldn't trust with a bowl of neon Tetras, right, to feed them for a couple days. So, in Ambrose's Band of Brothers, there's a line in there about how basically our troops were, morally superior to their troops, right? So, and otherwise, everything else is like, wow, this is, factual, accurate, going on. But that line is like, okay, wait a second, something's going on here. And the way you can see it is that in Band of Brothers, there are hints that possibly some of these soldiers killed German prisoners. There are hints at it, right? But if our soldiers are morally superior and the best human beings out there, you can't come out and say that, even if they did it. Now, the book that I really recommend, and Major Dick Winters was one of the people in Band of Brothers, but he kept copious notes. He was an amazing officer and also was never that impressed with the army, so it's kind of like the ideal officer. And in his story, when he writes it, he's like, yes, these soldiers killed prisoners, and he would say at certain times they were such good soldiers that we needed them, so we weren't going to punish them for that. Another thing to think about is paratroopers go behind the lines. So if you capture somebody behind the lines and you still need to fight, well, what are you going to do? Let this German go who will then kill you? You don't have the resources to send them someplace else, and so sometimes they were killed. And then the icing on the cake, probably a bad metaphor, but you can see interviews with the men in Band of Brothers, especially like Bill Garnier, who says, yeah, I killed them. Right? He found out his brother was killed right before D-Day. He was on a mission of vengeance, and he just says, yep, I killed them. But that gets taken out of Band of Brothers. Why? Because Stephen Ambrose has an agenda and a belief, right, that our soldiers, right, are better, morally superior, right? He can do that. It's nice, and it's inaccurate. Right? As far as, and here's the thing, if you're going to have an honest conversation about war, right, you're probably going to have to admit that your side has done terrible things if you're going to have an honest conversation about it. So, two things. One, if you think all the bad things are always done by somebody else, and it could never be done by us or our side, right? There's some delusional thinking going on there, because that's just not how humanity works, right? And the other thing is, or maybe not even delusional, maybe it's wishful thinking, but in either case, historically, that is not the way things have gone. And the other is when you are reading somebody, right? In the back of your mind, you do want to be thinking about, okay, both what are their values, what are their beliefs, and what are their goals, right? Because that will shape what's going on. It's also why I'm not having you write, when you do your larger paper, a persuasive paper. I don't want you to convince us that you are right. I want you to actually explore an area where you're willing to go, wow, I was right on that, but I was wrong on this part. It's not what I thought, right? We live in crazy times, and the last thing the world needs is more propaganda. So, there we go. The people, the men in this reserve battalion, right? They didn't volunteer. They didn't celebrate the killing, though they did it, right? They felt pity for themselves, right? And what a lot of the things that did this was conformity, peer preference, and deferring to the government. Now, so those are the reasons and how they justified what they did. Now, that in no way justifies what they did, right? And we can't forget that there were men who said no, right? So as far as thinking about the psychology of what's going on, which is what our latest way I want you to look at it, is to think about, right, there is more than, it would be great if we could just say, hey, look, they're monsters, we're angels. Then we don't have to think about what's really going on. But when we look at somebody and say, wow, they are a human being just like us, therefore, if I was in that situation, I might do something similar. Now we can get into a rich discussion and a look about what's going on. What is the role of obedience to the government, right? How powerful is peer pressure and conformity? What is it about some people that they can go and do that and volunteer, even though most didn't, right? But some did, yep, I'll go. And what is it that some people can stand up to that? And that's where it gets interesting. And the gift that Borofsky gives us is he strips it away from trying to make himself or anybody he was with look good, right? Even though clearly they were thrown in an impossible situation. Right? Keep reading, keep discussing, and there'll be more as we move on. All right, so there was a little bit about context and also a big part on, hey, as a writer, right, I'm not interested in your propaganda. I'm interested in what you actually find, right? And that's going to make all of our papers much more interesting.